Rafael Samuel rocketed to worldwide fame about 6 years ago with a simple lawsuit. He filed a lawsuit against his own parents for bringing him into the world without his consent. Now, 6 years later, he admits that that was pretty much nothing more than a publicity stunt. He knew the judge would throw it out and it didn't have any real standing, but he wanted to raise issues that he believes need serious consideration. Samuel is an anti-natalist. Let's talk about another bad idea that flows out of a secular worldview. Anti-natalism is a perspective, a position that has gained not a huge following, but a significant following around the world. It is made up of people who hold a position that believes that in order to end human suffering, that's their stated goal, in order to end human suffering, we must prohibit procreation. In other words, we need to stop having human beings born because human beings are inevitably born into suffering. The odds of life being positive, upbeat, hopeful are, in their minds, so small, so minuscule, that the risk of suffering and pain means that the better choice is to not be born at all. And these people are on a mission to stop human procreation. Now, where does this position come from? In 2006, the term anti-natalist, and the word natal, it comes from a Latin word that means to be born, and so it's related to birth. You might recognize the word we talk about at Christmas time. The scene with the birth of Jesus is called a nativity scene. It's related to the same word. The anti-natalist movement is this idea that because of climate disaster propaganda, because of a 24-hour news cycle that seems to highlight global suffering in a nonstop onslaught to your mind, these people have determined that human suffering is the overarching reality of the human condition, and the only way to avoid that is to never be born. In fact, they view never being born as a state of neutrality. Okay, follow me. I know this is crazy. This is intellectually vapid, but it's gaining a foothold, so we need to talk about it. And I want to show you how this bad idea is related to several other bad ideas because they all flow out of an underlying worldview. You've heard me talk time and time again. We can't fight every position at the level of the actions that you see sort of above the surface. It's the underlying worldview that ties all of these positions together, and that's where the battle, the intellectual battle, has to take place. This anti-natalist movement, with their announced goal of ending human suffering, started in 2006 with two different philosophers, David Benatar in South Africa and Theo de Girard in Belgium. They both published books in that year, coining this term anti-natalism and making the case this is not just about population control, this is about ending the flood of suffering that inevitably flows out of the simple fact of human existence. There are relatively large followings of this movement in India, in parts of Europe, in the United States, in the United Kingdom, and in Japan. There are three main arguments used in antinatalism. One is what Benatar, in his initial book, calls axiological asymmetry. Now, that's just a fancy philosophical term, which posits the idea that the experience of pain tips the scales in favor of never being born. In other words, you weigh the cost-benefit analysis of life versus non-life, and the suffering inherent in life gives the win to non-life as the best option. The other two arguments boil down to essentially consent and risk. Think about these sayings. We say that if sex without consent is rape, if work without consent is slavery, the anti-natalists then make the leap that says birth without consent is an equal injustice. Now, how you gain consent for birth from somebody who's not yet been conceived is an intellectual black hole that nobody in that movement ever tries to deal with. Their argument is simply that we decide for the babies that for them to never exist as human beings is in their best interest. Without jumping straight to theology, it seems like the basic premise of anti-natalism is essentially a God complex to make decisions about the very possibility for the existence of life. Now, that's not really a reach, because I'm going to show you that it's that attitude of the superiority of human beings as the decision makers, the defining force within creation. It's that attitude that produces a lot of bad ideas, and we're going to talk about that in just a minute. One writer in the movement said this: we think of children who are born and have a very short and brutal life and then maybe die of cancer. The risk that your child could be one of those cases is enough not to create the child in the first place. Now, I've run into this a little bit, even in Christian circles, with people who say, well, you know, the world is such a horrible place and there's such terrible things. I mean, isn't it better to not subject a child to the kinds of things that we have in the world? It's not safe, it's not right, it's not good. You see, what I want you to know is, even though you've never heard of the anti-natalist movement, the ideas are infiltrating even Christian circles because they're perpetuated as sort of a kind of bottom line compassion that just wants to avoid suffering in any way possible. Now, most Americans have children, but among those who do not have children, who choose not to have children, statistics tell us that it's typically not related to any kind of philosophical denial of the validity of children. Most Americans who don't have children do not report that they're against the concept of children. They simply argue that they don't want them, rather than having some kind of conviction that childbearing itself is wrong. But an anti-natalist will go all the way to the conclusion that the birth of a child is nothing more than the natural result of the selfishness of two other human beings. It turns human existence into a mathematical calculation. It makes us animalistic, as though childbearing and family rearing is nothing more than a primeval evolutionary instinct. And their argument is that the best approach to eliminate the suffering of humanity is to just not expand the population. One writer says that you see birth as a crime when you understand that human life is nothing but, quote, an accident of science. If there is no God, this is a quote from one of these writers, if there is no God, then there really is no reason to keep bringing new people here. All right, that's where I want us to look at. You can argue this position about whether people should have children on the basis of the need to replace our population. We know that population growth in most industrialized nations is not even at replacement levels. Every couple, every family needs to produce at least 2.1 births to break even, to keep population stable. Most nations are not at that population growth rate. In fact, the expectation is that by 2080, human population will have peaked and will be in decline based on current numbers. Many nations, particularly in the industrialized West, statistically speaking, we have already peaked and we're on the downward side, leading to what will eventually produce the inability to sustain nationhood. Now, you can argue about having babies from a pragmatic standpoint of securing the necessary population to keep a nation alive. You can talk about needing a generation to work and contribute so that those who are older can have the natural support of the economic growth of a nation. There are very kinds of pragmatic ways that you can argue the necessity to have children. And the decline in population in the modern era is a very disturbing trend. But understand, the best way to deal with this underlying philosophy is not the pragmatism of needing workers to support retirees or trying to maintain a certain population so that a nation doesn't cease to exist. We have to go to the very essence of what it means to be human. What is the biblical evaluation of human life? Is this simply an accidental entry, an unwanted entry into meaningless suffering that ends in indescribable pain and pointlessness? I mean, if that's your worldview, then anti-natalism is probably where you're going to land. But is that the way to look at human existence? Is banning human procreation a theologically sound position? Chuck Colson used to say that ideas have consequences and bad ideas have victims. Anti-natalism, along with some sister philosophies like abortion and euthanasia, these are bad ideas that have victims. Let me see if I can show you. The quote from one of the writers said, "If there is no God, then there really is no reason to keep bringing new people here." All right, that's the foundational premise. There is no God, so what's the point? The Bible is very clear that it's a fool who has said in his heart that there is no God. But if you go to that foolish position and deny what Romans 1 tells us is the reality of the existence of God that's been implanted in the hearts of human beings, I mean, even when we deny it, we know it. Deep down, we know this is not accidental. This is too complex to be random. We know that there is a God. Deny it, say you don't believe it all you want to, and yet you still function as though there's meaning and reason. There is nobody, even those who philosophically argue that human life is pointless and has no significance whatsoever, that is not a worldview you can actually live your life by. I mean, suicide is the only appropriate response to a truly, utterly, absolutely meaningless existence. If you haven't committed suicide, then you are not living that worldview. Why? Because implanted in your brain, in your heart, is an underlying understanding that there is meaning somewhere. Maybe you haven't discovered it, maybe you haven't identified it, but this life can't be utterly pointless. Now here's you got to follow the pattern. Once you have said there is no God, once you have denied the existence of God, if there's no God, that means there's no meaning in life. If there's no meaning in life, then there can be no purpose in life. In other words, there's no reason to get out of bed. There's no purpose to live by if nothing about your purpose produces any meaning. So here's the theological and intellectual train track. No God means no meaning in life, means no purpose in life. If there's no purpose in life, then there's no nobility to be found in human suffering. In other words, there's no example of someone in the midst of suffering or troubles living a life of nobility, of refusing to buckle under the weight of what it means to be a part of the human condition. There's no nobility there. It's just a pathetic, sad example of another person who is on their way to a black abyss of non-existence at the other end of life. Why not? Why shouldn't we have just left them in the black abyss of non-existence before they ever started that run? No God means there's no meaning, which means there's no purpose, which means there's no nobility found in suffering, which leads to this inevitable conclusion. The only proper position for human beings in this world is voluntary extinction. It's an interesting phrase. Voluntary extinction. How do we approach this? Well, just to show you that this is not some fringe idea that's out there that doesn't relate to anything, I would say that related to this idea of not bringing life into existence at all is related to the worldview that produces abortion. Abortion is simply legalized infanticide. In other words, it's taking a baby who happens to be not yet located outside of the womb, but still is no less a human being, and making it legal to kill that child. Most people wouldn't have the stomach to take a toddler out of his crib and strangle him to death. And yet, if that toddler is still in the womb, that same child with that same personality, with that same destiny inside the womb, he can be killed as a matter of course, and we tell ourselves that it's just a clump of cells, it's not even really a human being. The infanticide that is abortion is related to this idea that inconvenience and suffering is to be avoided at all costs because there's no meaning and there's no purpose ultimately. So the best we can do is sort of try and get by with the least amount of trouble possible. Also related to this is euthanasia. There's a British woman who died last Christmas, just a few weeks ago, in the United Kingdom. She had been in an accident that produced, she was 54 years old, and she had been in an accident that produced a coma for about 6 months. After she'd had a heart attack and was in a coma for 6 months, King's College Hospital decided that her life needed to be terminated. Now understand, this is not a family request. This is the request of her doctors. You know, the ones who took the Hippocratic oath to do no harm. The doctors decided that she should be allowed to die. They proceeded in that direction by, number one, refusing to perform a tracheotomy that would have allowed her family to care for her at home. See, if the issue was she's taking up resources in the hospital, there was an alternative. The family was willing to take her and provide care at home. She wouldn't have been in the hospital taking up resources. But that wasn't enough. Her doctors followed up their refusal to perform a tracheotomy. They followed up by actually filing a court order to withdraw life support. Remember, this is not a family request. This is the doctor's request. The family went to court opposing this order to withdraw life support, arguing that Hyacinth McIntosh was her name. They argued that Mrs. McIntosh had shown signs of improvement and that as a Christian, she would want her life to end naturally. An end-of-life professional also testified at that trial, arguing that depriving McIntosh of hydration would be cruel, degrading, and inhuman. The court on December 14th of 2024 ordered the removal of life support. The court charged the hospital to send her home and then issued a restraining order preventing the family from giving her anything after she had been discharged and taken home, anything that would prevent her from dying. They said, here, take your mama home and don't touch her until she's dead. She managed to breathe on her own for a short time, but she eventually died on Christmas morning of dehydration. Whether we refuse to bring human life into existence, whether we kill human life in the womb because it's inconvenient, or whether we end human life arbitrarily and prematurely at its end because it is unhelpful to us, there is an underlying principle in all of that. We are accidents, random products of chance and blind evolution. There is no God, which means there is no meaning, which means we can have no purpose, which means there's no nobility to be found in any part of human life, which means voluntary extinction is our only logical step. What does the Bible have to say about this? Two things. Genesis chapter 1, foundational verses. In Genesis 1:28, it says, God blessed them, and God said to them, be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth and subdue it, and rule over the fish of the sea and over the birds of the sky and over every living thing that moves on the earth. From the very moment of creation, God invested meaning and purpose and nobility in the human condition. Now, sin interrupted that, and sin made it hard. But the meaning and the purpose and the nobility did not go away. Why? Because it is all an outpouring of the reality of the existence of God, who wants to be in relationship with human beings. Look at verse 31 of Genesis 1. It says, "And God saw all that he had made, and behold, it was very good." You see, the attack of the enemy has always been to impugn the reputation of God and to suggest that what God said is not true. And the anti-natalist movement, the abortion movement, and the euthanasia movement all say the same thing. Human life is not good. It can be disposed of at any stage so long as it's convenient to the rest of us. And yet, from the very mouth of God, he looks at human life and says, it's very good. We are created in his image. We need to fight for life at every stage. At the point of not killing our old people against their will, at the point of not killing babies in the womb, and even arguing now at the point of those who would ban human procreation. These are intellectually vapid, hollow positions. We need truth tellers, truth speakers, to remind us that there is a God, so there is meaning, and there is a purpose, and there is nobility. And what we do here has eternal significance. Life is worth the risk of living. This is Truth Currents.